If you have ever watched a spy thriller or a classic James Bond film, you already know the ultimate cliché of global wealth. When the international villain needs to hide stolen billions or the corrupt politician demands a bribe, they always ask for the exact same thing: a numbered Swiss bank account. For decades, pop culture has sold us this sleek image of pristine alpine vaults, impenetrable steel doors, and silent, tight-lipped bankers in Geneva who ask absolutely no questions. But the reality of Swiss banking is far darker, far more powerful, and significantly more embedded in the global economy than any Hollywood script could ever depict. The Swiss bank account was never just a dramatic plot device. For over a century, it acted as the foundational pillar of a parallel financial universe. It was the ultimate shadow economy, engineered specifically so the global 1%, ruthless dictators, cartel leaders, and billionaire tax evaders could completely vanish their wealth from the watchful eyes of their own governments. While the middle and working classes across the world were heavily tracked, taxed, and trapped inside the traditional fiat system, the ultra-wealthy simply opted out. They used the geographical fortress of the Swiss Alps not just to store money, but to erase its origins entirely. But how exactly did this happen? How did a small, landlocked, mountainous country with practically no natural resources transform itself into the undisputed financial vault of the world? The mainstream narrative will tell you that Swiss banking secrecy was born out of a noble desire to protect the persecuted from tyrannical regimes. They will proudly point to their famous geopolitical stance of absolute neutrality. But when you strip away the public relations and look at the raw economic history, you quickly realize that neutrality is often just a highly profitable illusion. In this video, we are going to expose the bloody origins of Swiss banking secrecy. We will uncover how Switzerland played both sides during the darkest, most devastating conflicts in human history, quietly accepting gold stripped from the fallen while financing the machines of war. We will break down the exact economic mechanics of how these hidden accounts actually functioned to siphon wealth out of developing nations. And finally, we will reveal how the United States government, desperate to reclaim lost tax revenue, unleashed a brutal campaign of financial warfare to crack the vaults wide open, forcing today's elites in 2026 to abandon the Alps and hunt for new digital and offshore safe havens. Welcome to the dark history of the world's ultimate safe haven. To understand the impregnable fortress of Swiss banking, we have to strip away the romanticized myths and look at the cold, hard timeline of European history. The concept of banking secrecy in Switzerland is not a modern invention. It did not start in the 20th century. The seeds were actually planted all the way back in the year 1713. During this era, European monarchs and wealthy aristocrats had a serious problem. They needed a place to hide their vast fortunes from their own citizens and rival empires. In response, the Great Council of Geneva passed a law that strictly prohibited bankers from sharing information about their clients. From its very inception, Swiss banking secrecy was not designed to protect the vulnerable. It was designed to protect the European elite. But the true transformation, the moment Switzerland mutated from a quiet, mountainous nation into a global financial black hole, happened in the 1930s. Following the devastating crash of 1929, the global economy was in free fall. In France, the government was aggressively hunting down wealthy citizens to tax their fortunes and fix the national deficit. In Germany, the Nazi Party was rapidly rising to power, imposing brutal capital controls to prevent money from leaving the country. When the wealthy feel threatened, their money moves. And in the 1930s, terrified European elites began moving their wealth across the border into Switzerland at an unprecedented, staggering scale. This massive capital flight terrified the surrounding governments. The breaking point came in 1932. French police raided the Paris office of a major Swiss bank, the Basler Handelsbank.
What they found inside was a financial nuke, a ledger containing the names of over 2,000 of France's wealthiest citizens, including politicians, bishops, and generals, who were all illegally hiding their money in Switzerland to evade taxes. The scandal sent shockwaves through Europe. The Swiss banking empire was suddenly under severe threat. They realized that if foreign governments could simply pressure or raid their branches, the flow of foreign capital would instantly dry up. They needed an absolute, impenetrable legal shield. So in 1934, the Swiss government passed the Federal Act on Banks and Savings Banks. Specifically, Article 47 of this law changed the global financial system forever. It stated that any banker who revealed a client's identity or financial information to anyone, especially a foreign government, would face immediate imprisonment and massive fines. Secrecy was no longer just a business practice or a gentleman's agreement. It was now encoded into federal criminal law. With the 1934 law in place, the infamous numbered account was officially born. When a billionaire or a dictator opened an account, their name was completely erased from all standard banking documentation. Instead, they were assigned a multi-digit number. The true identity of the account holder was known only to a tiny handful of elite senior executives locked away in the highest echelons of the bank. If a foreign tax investigator came knocking, the average bank teller couldn't give them a name even if they wanted to. The information physically did not exist at their level. This is where the greatest public relations spin in financial history took place. At the exact same time this law was passed, the German Gestapo was actively hunting down foreign bank accounts of Jewish citizens trying to protect their wealth from the Nazi regime. For decades, the Swiss banking industry heavily promoted the narrative that the 1934 Banking Act was a noble humanitarian effort designed to protect Jewish assets from Hitler's grasp. It was a beautiful story, but economic historians have largely debunked it as a highly convenient cover. The 1934 law was not passed to protect human rights. It was passed to protect the banks from French tax inspectors and global regulators. The Swiss simply used the tragedy of the era as a moral shield to justify the creation of the most sophisticated, legally protected tax evasion system the world had ever seen. Switzerland had officially built the vault. But as the world descended into the bloodiest conflict in human history, the Swiss were about to prove just how dark their commitment to neutrality really was.
When a nation declares itself neutral during a massive global war, the general public usually views it as a noble, courageous commitment to peace. But in the ruthless, mechanical calculus of global finance, neutrality is rarely a moral stance. It is a highly lucrative, entirely amoral business model. As the fires of the Second World War consumed the European continent, Switzerland remained a pristine, untouched island of stability. While London was bombed and Paris was occupied by the Third Reich, the cafes in Zurich remained open and the bank vaults remained completely secure. For decades, historians asked a very simple question. Why didn't Hitler just invade Switzerland? They were sitting right on his border, entirely surrounded by Axis powers, holding massive amounts of wealth. The terrifying economic reality is that Hitler didn't invade Switzerland because a destroyed, occupied Switzerland was utterly useless to him. A functioning, independent, and neutral Swiss banking system, however, was the most valuable financial asset the Nazi war machine possessed. By the early 1940s, Germany had a massive economic crisis. War is incredibly expensive. To keep their tanks rolling and their planes flying, the Third Reich desperately needed to buy raw materials like tungsten and oil from other neutral countries like Spain and Portugal. But there was a fatal flaw in their system. The German currency, the Reichsmark, was completely worthless outside of Germany. Nobody would accept it. The only currency the global market would accept was the heavily backed, highly stable Swiss franc. To get those Swiss francs, the Nazis had to trade the ultimate hard money, gold.
By the early 1940s, Switzerland became the central financial clearinghouse for the Second World War. They continued to do business with the Allied forces, but they also became the indispensable financial lifeline for Nazi Germany. But the darkest chapter of this era, the reality that shattered the myth of Swiss innocence forever, was the origin of that gold. The Nazis were not just trading their own pre-war gold reserves. As the German army swept across Europe, they systematically looted the central banks of the nations they conquered, including Belgium and the Netherlands. They stripped entire countries of their national wealth, loaded it onto trains, and sent it straight to the Swiss National Bank and private Swiss vaults. But it gets much, much worse. A significant portion of the gold being transported to Switzerland was literally stripped from the victims of the Holocaust. The SS routinely confiscated wedding rings, jewelry, pocket watches, and even dental fillings from the prisoners of concentration camps. This stolen, blood-soaked gold was melted down into standard ingots, often stamped with fake pre-war dates to disguise its origins, and shipped across the border. Did the Swiss bankers know where this gold was coming from? Absolutely. The sheer volume of gold flowing out of a war-torn, economically depleted Germany made it mathematically impossible for the Swiss executives to be ignorant of its origins. Yet, under the legal and psychological shield of neutrality and banking secrecy, they asked no questions. They accepted the Nazi gold, locked it in their underground vaults, and handed over the clean, untraceable Swiss francs that allowed Germany to finance its war effort for years longer than it otherwise could have. When the war finally ended, the Swiss government deeply resisted efforts to return the looted wealth to the survivors and the ravaged nations of Europe. They hid behind their 1934 Secrecy Act, claiming that revealing account details or returning the assets would violate their federal laws. This is the brutal, unvarnished reality of the Swiss safe haven. The numbered accounts were not designed to protect the innocent. They were designed to process capital with zero moral friction. Neutrality did not mean peace. Neutrality simply meant we will gladly do business with anyone as long as they are placing their wealth inside our vaults. Having successfully survived the Second World War while simultaneously absorbing the wealth of a burning continent, Switzerland emerged as an undisputed financial superpower. But their greatest era of wealth accumulation was just about to begin. The post-war world was about to enter a new age of dictators, cartels, and massive global taxation, and the Swiss vaults were wide open and waiting.
When the dust settled after the Second World War, the global financial landscape had fundamentally changed. The United States had emerged as the undisputed economic superpower, establishing a new world order built on massive industrialization, the Bretton Woods system, and the almighty U.S. dollar. But as the 1950s rolled into the 1960s and 70s, a new kind of global conflict began to reshape the flow of money: the Cold War. During this era, Western governments, particularly the United States and the nations of Western Europe, began aggressively expanding their social welfare programs. To fund these massive projects and their rapidly growing militaries, they needed revenue. They needed taxes. Marginal tax rates in countries like the US and the UK skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. For the average working-class citizen, there was no escape. Their wages were tracked, their taxes were automatically deducted, and they were trapped inside the traditional fiat system. But for the global 1%, there is always an exit strategy. And that exit strategy was a direct flight to Zurich or Geneva. The wealthy elite of the developed world realized they could simply pack millions of dollars in cash into briefcases, fly to Switzerland, and deposit it into a numbered account. Because of the 1934 Banking Act, the Swiss banks were legally prohibited from reporting these deposits to the IRS or the British tax authorities. It was the perfect, legally protected offshore tax evasion scheme. The wealth of the Western world was silently bleeding into the Alps. But tax evaders were only one side of the coin.
The true explosion of the Swiss shadow economy came from the developing world. During the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union constantly fought proxy wars across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. They propped up brutal, corrupt dictators simply because those dictators aligned with their political ideology. These regimes received billions of dollars in foreign aid, military funding, and loans from organizations like the World Bank. Where did all that money go? It certainly didn't go to building hospitals or infrastructure in developing nations. It went straight into the Swiss vaults. Consider the staggering case of Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator of the Philippines. Over his two-decade rule, he and his wife Imelda systematically looted an estimated $5 billion to $10 billion from the Philippine treasury. While his people lived in crushing poverty, Marcos created a complex web of shell companies and fake foundations, eventually funneling billions of stolen dollars directly into Swiss bank accounts. When you look closely at the mechanics of this system, the Swiss banking model becomes clear. It was an incredibly efficient vacuum cleaner designed to suck the capital out of unstable, impoverished nations. Dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Sani Abacha of Nigeria, would steal their nation's wealth, convert it into hard currency, and deposit it under the impenetrable shield of Swiss secrecy. The banks didn't ask how a government official on a modest salary suddenly acquired $500 million in cash. The 1934 law protected them from asking. They simply accepted the money, charged exorbitant management fees, and used that massive zero-cost capital to invest in global markets, exactly like Warren Buffett used insurance float, but on a much darker geopolitical scale. Switzerland had successfully built a parallel financial universe. By the 1990s and early 2000s, it is estimated that 1/3 of all global offshore wealth was sitting inside Swiss bank accounts. They were untouchable. They had survived 2 world wars, they had survived the Cold War, and they believed their fortress of secrecy would last forever. They had successfully defeated every tax authority on Earth. But they were about to make a fatal miscalculation. They were about to anger the only entity on the planet powerful enough to bring their entire empire crashing down. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the hidden history of global wealth and want to understand how the real economy actually works behind closed doors, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss our upcoming documentaries where we continue to expose the systems that control our world. For over 70 years, the Swiss banking cartel believed their 1934 Secrecy Act was an impenetrable, invincible fortress. They had survived World War II, the Cold War, and the collapse of empires without ever handing over a single client list. But they were about to learn a brutal geopolitical lesson. You can hide money from dictators and developing nations, but you do not mess with the tax revenue of the American empire. The catalyst for the destruction of Swiss banking secrecy arrived in 2008. The global financial system had just collapsed. The United States government was drowning in debt, actively bailing out Wall Street, and desperately hunting for fresh capital. The Internal Revenue Service, IRS, knew that wealthy Americans were hiding hundreds of billions of dollars in offshore accounts entirely tax-free. But because of the 1934 law, the U.S. government couldn't pierce the Swiss veil. They needed a man on the inside. In 2007, they found one. His name was Bradley Birkenfeld, a private wealth banker working for UBS, the largest bank in Switzerland. Birkenfeld walked into the United States Department of Justice and blew the whistle on the entire underground operation. He didn't just bring rumors, he brought the exact blueprints of how the shadow economy functioned. He exposed how Swiss bankers were operating like international smugglers. They were frequently flying into the United States on private jets, attending luxury events like Art Basel, exclusive golf tournaments, and high-end yacht shows to actively recruit American millionaires. In one of his most famous revelations, Birkenfeld admitted to smuggling diamonds across international borders hidden inside a tube of toothpaste for a wealthy American client.
The illusion of the passive, neutral Swiss banker was completely shattered. They were not just holding money, they were active accomplices in a massive, coordinated tax evasion conspiracy against the United States. The U.S. government was furious, but they didn't send the military to Geneva. They used a weapon far more destructive, the weaponized U.S. dollar. In the modern fiat system, all global trade and major banking transactions must run through the U.S. dollar. The Department of Justice gave UBS a devastating mob-style ultimatum. Hand over the names of your American tax evaders, or the U.S. government will officially indict the bank, revoke its American banking license, and completely cut it off from the U.S. clearing system. For a massive global financial institution, losing access to the U.S. dollar is not just a penalty, it is a death sentence. It is instant financial vaporization. Faced with total corporate annihilation, the impenetrable Swiss fortress finally crumbled. In 2009, UBS admitted to criminal conspiracy, paid a massive $780 million fine, and did the absolutely unthinkable. They broke their own 1934 law and handed over the names of over 4,000 American clients to the IRS. But the United States was not done. To ensure this never happened again, the U.S. passed a ruthless, aggressive piece of legislation in 2010 called FATCA, the RN Account Tax Compliance Act. FATCA was a masterstroke. It essentially forced every single foreign bank on planet Earth to become an unpaid branch of the IRS. The law stated that if a Swiss bank refused to automatically report the account details of their American clients, the U.S. government would slap a 30% withholding tax on all of that bank's U.S.-based investments. Switzerland had no choice. The leverage was too immense. By 2014, they officially capitulated and signed the agreement. Soon after, they signed similar agreements with over 100 other countries, agreeing to automatically exchange financial information. After 80 years of absolute silence, the legendary Swiss vault had been cracked wide open by the sheer economic gravity of the American empire. The era of the anonymous numbered Swiss bank account was officially dead. But did this mean the global 1% finally gave up and started paying their fair share of taxes? Not even close. They just found a new place to hide.
The fall of Swiss banking secrecy was hailed by politicians as a massive historic victory for global transparency. The media celebrated the end of the shadowy numbered account. But if you think the global 1%, the oligarchs and the corrupt politicians just surrendered and started paying their fair share of taxes, you don't understand how elite wealth works. Capital is like water. When you block one path, it simply flows to the next path of least resistance. In a massive, almost comical twist of geopolitical irony, the nation that destroyed the Swiss vault essentially replaced it, because the United States forced the rest of the world to share financial data through FATCA, but refused to fully sign on to reciprocal international transparency standards. The U.S. legally became the new Switzerland. Today, some of the biggest tax havens on Earth are not located in the snowy Alps. They are located in places like South Dakota, Delaware, and Wyoming, where billions of dollars of foreign elite wealth are legally shielded inside anonymous trusts. But for the modern elite who no longer trust the fiat system or any government jurisdiction, the new safe haven isn't a physical vault at all. It is a digital ledger. Bitcoin and decentralized hard assets have become the ultimate numbered accounts of the 21st century, completely unconfiscatable, borderless, and mathematically secure from the prying eyes of the state. The game of hiding and protecting wealth is evolving faster than ever, and as the global fiat system continues to destabilize under a mountain of debt, knowing where to safely park your capital is no longer a strategy reserved just for billionaires. It is a matter of financial survival for everyone. If a massive economic crisis hits tomorrow, the traditional assets that the middle class relies on will be completely wiped out. To understand exactly where the smart money is moving and how to protect yourself before the system breaks, you need to watch my essential guide right now.
The only 5 assets that survive economic collapse and what goes to zero. Click the video on your screen right now or find the link down in the pinned comment below. Secure your wealth before the vault closes forever. I will see you in that video.